Because that's the other thing about this. The villain of the piece not only has to have enormous resources at their disposal to perpetrate whatever the conspiracy is, they have to have absolutely no scruples at anything. I mean, you have conspiracists who are absolutely insistent that Tony Blair or George Bush or Bill Clinton before them would casually order opponents or
they have to be
they
have to be practically infernally immoral. It's certainly, I mean, and it's interesting you mentioned Clinton. I don't talk about this in the book, but there were right-wing conspiracy theories about Clinton when he was in office, that he'd had his aide, Vince Foster, murdered, this man who committed suicide and so on, or that he deliberately ordered attacks on Al-Qaeda targets cynically in order to take attention away from his affair with Monica Lewinsky, you know, kind of belief that actually presidents act for such incredibly sort of capricious and bizarre reasons in the modern world. In other words, his immorality, having been shown in the Monica Lewinsky case, was actually total, and also his organisation was infernal.
But there are serious people though, out there, people who have a long track record, for example, of scrutinising government, who can find that there's a very thin line between, you know, exposing ministerial misdoings at a question time in the House of Commons and buying into, quite seriously, I mean, you do the case of one of the great parliamentary heroes of our time, Tam Dalyell, who became convinced that a particular anti-war activist had been murdered in the mid-80s.
No, that's right. This is the case of Hilda Murrell, who was murdered in Shrewsbury, abducted from a house found in a copse of woods in 1984. And the police said this is a burglary that's gone wrong as far as we can see. But a great kind of superstructure was built up whereby people said, no, look, either one of two things. She was an objector to the next generation of nuclear power stations, and therefore an enemy of the state in some kind of a way. Or, secondly, which was Dalyell's argument, her nephew had been in naval intelligence at the time of the sinking of the Belgrano during the Falklands War, which he had a particular obsession about and pursued Mrs. Thatcher about for years. So he stood up in the House of Commons and said that he had actually been told that this was a security operation that had gone wrong. They'd used some kind of sub-team or other who'd gone in there, instead of, you know, robbing her of whatever it was she was supposed to have, they'd found her there, and in order to keep her quiet, they'd killed her, and it had all gone wrong. Anyway, the case wasn't solved for 20 years. Then a cold case was opened up. DNA was available from the scene, which couldn't be analysed back in the mid-80s, and was traced back to a guy who at the time had been a 16-year-old in care locally, and he was convicted. There was an appeal. The appeal was not upheld, and he is now in prison for the murder of Hilda Murrell. Is there an apology from Tam Dalyell? Is there heckers like? And as if that wasn't kind of interesting enough, we have a current Tam Dalyell wannabe in the shape of the Liberal Democrat MP Norman Baker, who has said exactly the same set of things about the death of the government scientist David Kelly in 2003, has effectively argued, well, he has argued that it was a murder which was tolerated by the British government of Tony Blair. So in other words, Blair, in his view, was capable of almost that kind of infernality that the people who believe in 9/11 believe about Bush.
It's clearly an honest belief. He doesn't stand to benefit from it in any particular way.
It's totally honest.
And the point is, though, that if you don't have people asking questions and you dismiss everybody as a conspiracy theorist, there's a thin line the other way too. You start discouraging all inquiry into any kind of mysterious wrongdoing. So one walks a tightrope on this.
You do. But let's take the case of Norman Baker. A concentration on a theory which is deeply improbable, and a kind of almost perverse determination against the facts to try and make your conspiracy theory fit, at the very least means you're not doing other things that you could be doing with your scepticism at the time. At the very least, there's an opportunity cost. There's an opportunity cost to everybody else as well. There's an opportunity cost in people believing stuff that is nonsensical, concentrating on it, believing the world works in a certain way when in fact it doesn't. But I agree. The idea that simply as soon as somebody says something for which they may have evidence, you say, that's a conspiracy theory, therefore I won't even look at it, that's wrong. I mean, I think I've had to earn the right to write the book by looking through the cases that people have made and discover they're wrong. But by and large, you do begin to achieve an instinct. You shouldn't obviously trust it too much for what is likely and what is not likely, for the way in which people tend to behave and the way in which they don't, and the reasons why we have the operation of what we call Occam's razor. In other words, the reasons why the more complex and less probable explanation is usually not the right one.
A final thought. Is conspiracism now in our blood? I was very struck just on my homeward commute, looking through the bookshelf in my local newsagent at the railway station. You can buy half a dozen paperbacks in which deranged Roman Catholic cardinals are sending out assassins to kill archaeologists who stumbled across the truth of the life of Christ, etc. It's there, isn't it? It's in the subculture.
Well, of course it is, because it's the better story, in a way. I mean, when I first touted the possibility of doing this book, some publishers were saying to me, well, look, you know, people will buy books about conspiracy theories being true, but we doubt very much whether they'll buy a book about conspiracy theories not being true. But as it happens, there is now a strong vein of desire for what I would call kind of true scepticism, real scepticism books. I mean, books like Ben Goldacre's Bad Science, which looks at the way in which science is misrepresented and is treated with a kind of in an illiterate fashion in the press and elsewhere, is one of the absolute bestsellers at the moment, and it's a really excellent book. And I like to think that this sort of fits into the same kind of vein which is now out there, which is sort of counterblast to the tendency you're talking about, of kind of real scepticism, of people who want to be armed with something, so the next time some credulous so-and-so sticks their face forward and their finger forward at the dinner party or in the bar, they at least have some kind of weaponry to discharge in return.
Well, on instructions from alien space lizards from the planet Zorg, I have to end it there. David Aaronovitch, thanks very much for joining us on Book Talk. And Book Talk will be back again next week. Join us then.